So in the previous video, we saw how we needed to lift state up to the board component in order to be able to manage the entire game. So now the board is in charge of the array of checks. We don't see any, of course, change in the game yet because we haven't coded it yet. The next thing to think about is the click method for the buttons, right? That's also, in the previous work, local to the button itself. The board needs to know when the button is clicked. So in React, know that the philosophy is that information goes from the parent to the child. There's a one-way flow of information. So how do we know, given that the board needs to know the click event, how do we get the click event knowledge into the board? And with staying true to the philosophy that knowledge flows from parent component to child component and never the other way around in React. So we need the click method needs to move to board. So we have this handle click method here. And notice what's happening here. This makes a copy of the state, the current state, this.state.squares. So you should never modify state directly in React. This makes a copy of the array, of the state array, and puts it in squares. So we're not modifying state directly. Now even the slice method may have a problem. If the state, it doesn't appear here, the state is filled, in this case, it's going to be filled with primitive values. So no problem with doing a slice. If the state, though, has an embedded object in it, then slice is not sufficient because that embedded object will be shallow. Just something to think about. Slice is sufficient here, but not safe in all cases, that is, when state has an embedded object. So we set the copy to X, and then we call set state. So recall that set state causes the component itself to re-render because it's a change in the UI, and it also causes the subcomponents to re-render as well. So by calling state here, we now know the state of the squares in the board component, and we know when they're being changed. So no visible change to our React application yet, but we have the mechanism now in place to know not only that the initial state of the squares, but when the click method occurs, that it knows that has been changed. The squares, essentially the state of the squares, has changed in the board. So we have the mechanism in place to switch between X's and O's and to know who wins the game. So let's look at a little bit more of the mechanisms here. So we have the onClick, this.handleClick. So we're referring it back to this method here. So that when the click method here, because we're using the value here of the initial square, we're passing it here. We're passing a second property here, the onClick method, to this square component. So from the square component, we do this.props.onClick to hook it up to the onClick method. So that's really a callback method, but a callback method that's now owned by board. So when that's clicked, it renders the state, it sets the state, and that causes the render method for board, and it also causes the render method for square, which are child components of boards. All right. Next, we're going to modify the internal logic of board in order to be able to manage our game.